We're always digging for those answers, right? Those satisfying bits of knowledge. But have you ever stopped to think about what gets us started on that search in the first place? What kicks off the whole process? It's the questions, of course.
Absolutely.
It seems simple enough at first. We ask because we want to know.
Right?
But if you really start to think about it, you'll find that there's this whole fascinating world of philosophical thought dedicated to understanding what a question really is at its core.
I like that at its core.
And that's what we're going to be doing today, diving deep into the philosophy of questions.
That's right. For this deep dive, we've gone through the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on questions.
Oh, a dense one.
It's a really in-depth piece, like a map for anyone who wants to understand how philosophers think about inquiry.
Oh, wow.
From the most basic definitions to the complex debates about meaning and knowledge.
A lot to cover then.
Yeah.
But as always, we're here to pull out the key ideas from this philosophical treasure trove and bring them to you.
Yes, and we'll look at how philosophers have thought about questions over the centuries.
Sounds good.
And trust me, you'll find some surprising twists in something we usually take for granted.
I do love a good twist.
And this isn't just some abstract theory.
Right.
This is about understanding how we build knowledge and how those everyday questions we ask are actually structured.
So important.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump in.
Yeah.
The entry starts by reminding us that while philosophy often focuses on statements and propositions, things that are either true or false questions are just as fundamental.
Yes, they are.
I mean, think about it. Major scientific breakthroughs often start with a simple why.
Right.
Our everyday conversations are a back and forth of questions and answers.
Yeah.
So to even start thinking about questions philosophically, we need to define what a question actually is, what's at its heart.
Yes, you need to start with the basics. We need to distinguish between the words we use to ask the question, the interrogative sentence, and the underlying meaning, the question itself. Belknap and Steele, who are really important in this area, think of a question as an abstract entity.
Okay.
Kind of like how a proposition is the abstract meaning behind a statement.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the act of asking, which we usually see as a way of requesting information.
Right. So alongside the idea of a question, you have the idea of an answer.
Of course.
But even that gets kind of tricky.
It does.
The entry talks about Belknap and Steele's idea of an answer being something that completely answers the question.
Okay.
But even their own example shows how slippery this can be. Take the question, who was the president of the USA in 1978? Now, you could answer with Jimmy Carter was the president, or just Jimmy Carter.
Sure.
You could even just describe him and say, someone who was over 3 inches tall. And believe it or not, a philosopher named Braun actually argues that this could count as a correct answer.
Well, it is technically correct.
It's true. But it shows that our everyday idea of what makes a good answer can be pretty vague.
Yes.
As philosophers who aim for clarity and precision, we need more rigorous definitions.
Right.
It's not just about what feels right, but about having a solid way to analyze how questions and their answers relate.
I agree. And then you have the idea of a presupposition.
Oh, yeah. This is important.
Belknap and Steele define it as a statement that has to be true in order for the question to even have a true or correct answer. So in our example about the president in 1978, the presupposition is that the USA had just one president at that time.
Right.
If that assumption wasn't true, say there were 2 presidents in 1978, then the question wouldn't really have a true answer as it's worded. You'd need what Belknap and Steele call a corrective answer, which would address the flawed presupposition itself.
Right. So something like, actually, the USA had 2 presidents that year.
Exactly.
But crucially, these corrective answers aren't seen as direct answers to the original question. They're addressing something deeper about the question itself.
That's a good distinction.
Okay, so we've got our basic building blocks. We've got how we phrase the question, the underlying question itself, the act of asking what an answer is, and those assumptions built into the question.
Right.
Now, the entry dives into different types of questions, starting with what are called whether questions.
Yes. Whether questions are those that have a limited set of possible answers.
Right. So the classic yes-no question like, was there a quorum at the meeting?
Exactly.
The direct answers are simply yes or no, or there was a quorum, or there was no quorum.
Right. And like we talked about with presuppositions, this question assumes that there was a meeting in the first place.
So the meeting didn't take place would be a corrective answer, not a direct one.
Exactly.
Now, whether questions can also give us more than just 2 options.
Yeah. Yes, they can.
Like, does Jones live in Italy, in Spain, or in Germany?
Right.
And this one's interesting because it could be interpreted a couple of ways.
Okay.
Is it a yes-no question? does Jones live in any of those countries?
Right.
Or is it giving us three distinct possibilities to choose from?
Exactly.
Italy, Spain, or Germany. If it's the latter, then the question assumes that Jones lives in one of those three countries.
Right.
And a corrective answer would be Jones doesn't live in Italy, Spain, or Germany.
You got it.
Now, alongside weather questions, Belknap and Steele identify another fundamental type, which questions.
Yes.
These are the questions where the number of possible answers could be massive, even infinite.
Right.
Like, what is the smallest prime number greater than 12? Or think about who shot J.R.
Classic.
There's no set list of potential responses. It
Yeah.
really opens things up.
It does.
Now, Belknap and Steele group both weather and which questions under the umbrella term elementary questions.
Okay.
And that's where the entry really gets into the meat of things, the semantics or the meaning of these elementary questions.
Right. The big question is, how do we formally understand what these questions mean? How can we pin down their meaning in a precise way?
Right.
The entry starts by exploring what are known as classical semantic theories.
Okay.
And the first one up is Hamblin semantics.
Right, Hamblin. So as I understand it, the core idea here is that a question presents us with a choice between different statements.
Okay.
These statements being the possible answers to the question.
Right?
Now, Hamblin himself proposed that a question essentially denotes or refers to the entire set of all possible answers.
Okay.
But then later, Kartunen refined this a bit, suggesting that a question denotes only the set of true answers in a specific scenario.
A subtle but important distinction.
So what's the main difference here?
Well, as Kartunen pointed out, the difference between these two views isn't a huge deal breaker.
Okay.
In both cases, the meaning of the question is tied to those propositions that could potentially answer it. So a question isn't just about what we don't know, but rather a structured set of possibilities that we're considering.
So it kind of lays out the boundaries of potential knowledge, right?
Yeah, it's like the question itself creates the space for what we might come to know.
I like that. But now here's where things get really interesting. The entry points out a major challenge with this whole approach. What exactly counts as a possible answer?
Oh, this is a tricky one.
To give this great example, who is coming for dinner tonight? Now you could answer, Paul is coming.
Oh, okay.
Well, only Paul and Nina are coming. Or even some people I know are coming.
Right.
Or you can just say, I have no idea.
Sure.
Now, Hamblin and Kartunen's theories might only accept that first one, Paul is coming, as a direct answer.
Okay.
But why? Where do we draw the line? What are the rules for deciding what makes the cut as a possible answer?
That's the big question. These classical theories give us a way to think about questions within a certain framework, but they don't really give us a clear-cut answer to that fundamental question of what makes something a possible answer in the first place.
Right. So we need a broader, more universal way to define a possible answer if we want to really analyze all the different kinds of questions we ask in everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
So this brings us to the next classical theory, which is partition semantics developed by Grothendieck and Stokov. This one takes a different approach. Instead of a set of possible answers, they argue that a question in any given possible world points to a single proposition,
Okay.
the one that provides the complete and true answer to that question in that specific world.
Interesting.
So back to our dinner example, if in one possible scenario, the only people coming are Paul and Nina, then the meaning of who is coming for dinner in that world would be the statement, only Paul and Nina are coming.
Got it.
So the meaning of the question becomes this function that takes each possible world and gives us that unique, true, and complete answer. And these answers have two important characteristics. They're mutually exclusive,
Okay.
meaning two different complete answers can't both be true at the same time.
Right.
And together, they cover every single possibility.
So they form what's called a partition of the logical space.
Yes, exactly. Imagine all the different ways the world could be.
Right.
The question divides them all up into these separate, non-overlapping, exhaustive answers.
I like that analogy.
And one of the cool things about partition semantics is that in many cases, it lines up pretty well with what we intuitively feel is a complete answer.
Yes, it does.
It gives us something concrete to check our gut feelings against.
Yeah.
But the entry points out some big challenges, especially with conditional questions like, if Anne is coming, will Bill come? And alternative questions like, is Anne coming or will Bill?
Right.
And this really shows that questions can be more complex than just having a set of neat and tidy, mutually exclusive answers.
Especially when we get into hypotheticals.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So with that conditional question, if Anne is coming, will Bill come? It's hard to say what that single true exhaustive answer would be in every possible situation.
Right.
Is it just, yes, if Ann comes, Bill comes? Or do we need to think about what happens if Ann doesn't come? And the entry points out that if we take the entire conditional as the answer, then in cases where Ann doesn't come, the answer seems to overlap with the answer to a different question. The question of whether Bill wouldn't come if Ann did.
Okay.
They're not neatly separated anymore.
Right.
And with alternative questions like, is Ann coming or will Bill? The problem is that certain types of answers feel different from others.
Okay.
So answers like neither's coming or both are coming feel different than only Ann is coming or only Bill is coming.
Right.
A simple partition semantics struggles to capture those subtle but important distinctions.
I see.
So classical semantics gives us some valuable frameworks for thinking about what questions mean, but it also runs into some pretty big limitations.
It does.
So the entry then moves into dynamic semantics and how questions are viewed from that perspective. And here the focus shifts from seeing meaning as a static representation to understanding it as something that can change the context of a conversation.
Right. It's a more dynamic view of meaning. And early dynamic theories, building on partition semantics, model the context of a conversation as a set of possible worlds that are considered equivalent, worlds that we can't distinguish between based on what we know so far. And this equivalence relation also tells us what questions are currently being considered.
Okay, so two worlds are considered equivalent if the difference between them isn't relevant to the current conversation.
Exactly.
So when we make a statement, we're basically narrowing down the set of possible worlds that fit with what we've said. We're eliminating possibilities,
Right.
but what about questions?
Questions sort of break those worlds apart based on whether they have different true and complete answers. It's like you have a map of all the possibilities, and when you make an assertion, you erase the parts of the map that are no longer possible.
More like that.
But when you ask a question, you draw lines on the map separating the possibilities based on the different answers.
That's a really helpful way to visualize it. But these early dynamic theories inherited some of the same problems that we saw with partition semantics, right? Especially with those tricky conditional and alternative questions.
Yes, and there's also a more fundamental conceptual issue about the nature of this equivalence relation.
Right, the idea that this indifference relation should always be transitive.
Exactly.
So if I can't tell the difference between world A and world B, and I also can't tell the difference between world B and world C, why should that automatically mean I can't tell the difference between A and C?
Yeah, it's a good question.
The example they give in the entry about wanting to distinguish between world W and world V, but not necessarily either of those from world U, really highlights this point.
It does.
So to address this issue, Gornadike and Mascarin has suggested some revisions where this indifference relation is only required to be reflexive,
Okay.
meaning everything is indistinguishable from itself
Right.
and symmetric.
Which means that if A is indistinguishable from B, then B is also indistinguishable from A.
Right, but not necessarily transitive.
Okay.
So they argued that this more flexible approach could better deal with those complex conditional and alternative questions.
Makes sense.
But it didn't completely solve the problem, Deb.
No, unfortunately not.
The entry mentions the work of Teardelli and Rolofson, who showed that with even more complex alternative questions, especially those with 3 or more options, this non-transitive approach still had problems.
Okay.
It seems like we can't perfectly capture the meaning of questions just using these kinds of indifference relations.
And that brings us to inquisitive semantics,
Ah, yes, inquisitive semantics.
which is a newer and increasingly popular way of looking at questions in the field.
Okay, so what's the main idea behind inquisitive semantics?
Well, it changes how we think about what a proper answer is. Instead of just looking at whether an answer is true or complete, inquisitive semantics emphasizes whether an answer resolves the issue raised by the question.
So it's not just about giving the right information, but about actually addressing the heart of what's being asked.
Exactly.
I like that.
And this leads to a really important feature of question meanings in inquisitive semantics. They need to be what we call downward closed.
Downward closed. What does that mean?
It means that if a certain proposition resolves a question, then any stronger, more informative proposition that contains all the information from the first one also has to resolve the question.
Okay, so give me an example.
Sure. Imagine you have a set of increasingly detailed instructions for getting to a particular destination.
Okay.
Now, if the very detailed set of instructions gets you there, it resolves the issue of how to reach your destination.
Right.
Then any less detailed set of instructions that still gets you to that same place will also work.
Okay, that makes sense. So the more detailed instructions are like a stronger proposition and the less detailed ones are weaker, but they both ultimately resolve the question of how to get to the destination.
Precisely. So in inquisitive semantics, the meaning of a question is defined as a downward closed set of propositions that together cover all the logical possibilities.
Okay.
And here's what's really fascinating. Partitions, the key idea from Grandendijk and Stokhoff's theory, turn out to be just a specific type of inquisitive question, meaning they're not the only kind.
So inquisitive semantics is a more general way to think about what a question's meaning is.
Exactly. It can handle cases where multiple different propositions can resolve a question without needing those propositions to form a strict, non-overlapping partition.
So it's more flexible.
It is. And the entry also points out that the set of these inquisitive meanings forms a Heyting algebra, which is a mathematical structure that lets us deal with logical connectives like and or in a more nuanced way.
Oh, wow.
It's basically a way of doing logic that's more flexible than the traditional true or false kind of logic, which works really well for understanding questions where the answers might be partial or require further investigation.
So it's like a special logic for questions.
In a way, yes. And it's an active area of research with people developing extensions to incorporate presuppositions, type theory, anaphoric references, discourse models, and even dynamic epistemic logic to model how our knowledge and the questions we ask change as we learn.
It sounds like there's a lot going on in this field. So after this deep dive into the meaning of elementary questions, the entry moves into why questions, which are fascinating, but also a bit more challenging.
Definitely more challenging.
And the entry notes that unlike whether questions, where you can be pretty formal and rule-based about the relationship between the question and the answer, formalizing why questions is much harder.
Right.
We encounter three main approaches here. First up is Bromberger's formal approach.
Okay.
His goal is to bring the same kind of rigor we saw with elementary questions to why questions. And he connects his ideas to Hempel's well-known deductive nomological, or DN model of scientific explanation.
Yeah.
Now, Bromberger introduces several key concepts, like the presupposition of a why question. Why is it the case that P inherently assumes that P is actually true, as well as the ideas of general rules and special abnormic laws?
Okay.
And these abnormic laws involve what he calls antonymic predicates, which are words with opposite meanings.
Right.
He's interested in how these general rules can be completed by those special abnormic laws.
Yeah.
It gets pretty complex, involving DN explanations and hypothetical scenarios where a different situation would be explained if certain conditions were true.
Okay.
And they use the example of gas expansion to illustrate this.
Right.
The answer, the pressure of a squelch was kept constant, is considered correct, based on these formal conditions involving abnormic laws and scientific principles.
Right.
Bromberger even tries to use his framework to explain why certain answers to why questions just don't feel right.
Like explaining the height of a pole by talking about a wire attached to it?
Exactly. He argues that his theory rules out those kinds of answers. But the entry also discusses criticisms raised by Teller, who shows how Bromberger's approach might still allow for other kinds of problematic answers that don't really provide a satisfying explanation.
Okay.
So next we have Van Frassen's pragmatic approach, which offers a totally different perspective.
Yeah.
He argues that explanation isn't some special objective relationship between a theory and reality, but rather a description that's meant to answer a why question.
Okay, so it's all about the question.
Right. His is what's called an erotetic theory of explanation, one that's grounded in questions.
Interesting.
Van Frassen defines a why question as a combination of three things: a topic, the thing we're asking about, which is assumed to be true, a contrast class, a set of other possibilities where only the topic is true, and a contextually relevant relation of explanation.
So when we ask why do birds fly south,
Right.
we're implying a contrast why birds and not something else.
Exactly. And according to Van Frassen, a direct answer basically confirms the topic, denies the other possibilities in the contrast class, and then gives us a statement, the core of the answer, that fits that contextually relevant explanatory relationship.
Got it.
And the word because is mainly there to signal that we're giving an explanation. It doesn't really add anything to the truth of the statement itself.
Okay.
Van Frassen also lays out the presuppositions of a why question and what happens when those presuppositions fail. Either the question doesn't make sense or it just doesn't have an answer. And they use the example of paresis, which is the condition linked to syphilis, to show how the context and the contrast class can really affect what we consider a good and relevant answer.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, the entry then talks about the work of Cross, who applies this pragmatic perspective to how questions, specifically those that are asking for an explanation.
So how questions where how basically means in what way.
Exactly. And Cross argues that these kinds of how questions also use explanatory contrast, just like why questions. For example, how do DNA molecules replicate as opposed to other complex molecules?
Okay.
He introduces the idea of a contrast value to deal with cases where all those contrasting possibilities might actually be true.
Interesting.
And in the end, he proposes that both how and why questions are fundamentally explanatory questions with the same basic structure.
So what's the difference then?
The main difference is the specific type of relevance relation, whether it's a reason or a way. And the words we use to signal the answer, we use because for why and by, or in this way for how. But there are some counter-arguments here. Risjord, for example, suggests that some how questions might actually be reducible to why questions with specific contrast values, so he's not fully on board with unifying them completely. Now, this whole pragmatic approach has its critics, of course. Philosophers like Kitcher and Salmon have pointed out that there aren't strict enough rules for this relevance relation. They argue that it could potentially allow almost anything to count as an answer depending on the context.
Okay.
And others like Rubin and Temple have questioned whether we even need this idea of explanatory contrast. They argue that why questions with contrast could be rephrased as why questions without contrast. But as an example involving veganism and chocolate allergies shows that kind of rephrasing doesn't always work. The questions end up asking for different things.
Right.
And finally, we get to Skou's metaphysical approach to why questions. He says that a theory of explanation is basically a theory of what makes a good answer to a why question. And for him, those answers are always reasons why.
Okay.
He believes these reasons why are either causes or grounds, the underlying reasons for why something is the case, and that these reasons exist at different levels.
Different levels.
Yeah, they use the example of striking a match. So striking the match is the lower level reason why it lit up, while the laws of physics that govern combustion are a higher level reason why striking the match caused it to light up.
Interesting.
So Skou argues that theories like the DN model mix up these levels by including those laws of nature in the explanation of a specific event.
Okay.
Now, Lawler has a counter-argument here, suggesting that those second-level reasons like the laws of physics should actually be part of a complete answer to a why question. So answers aren't always just about the immediate cause or ground.
Right.
And then Väyrynen offers another criticism, saying that Skou's focus on causes and grounds doesn't really work when we're talking about normative explanations about what we ought to do. He brings up the idea of reason enablers, like having the ability to shovel snow.
Okay.
This ability isn't a direct reason why you should help your neighbor shovel their driveway, and it's not a reason why other facts are reasons why you should help. So even when we focus on this seemingly straightforward question of why, we encounter this whole range of philosophical viewpoints, each trying to grasp a different aspect of what it means to ask for and receive an explanation.
It's a good point.
And the last major section of this deep dive tackles embedded or indirect questions. These are those questions that are embedded within larger sentences, often as the object of verbs like know or wonder.
Like John knows who spoke to Mary.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this area really sits at the intersection of philosophy of language and epistemology, the study of knowledge.
It does.
And it focuses specifically on knowledge one, knowing who, what, whether, where, why, or how.
Right.
The entry makes a point of distinguishing this from knowledge how, like knowing how to ride a bike, which is generally considered a separate topic in philosophy.
Good to know.
Now, one way to approach this is through what's called the imperative epistemic theory, which is associated with the philosophers like Åkvist and Hintikka. This theory proposes that asking a question is essentially like giving a command to the person you're asking. You're commanding them to make it so that you, the speaker, know the answer.
So like the question is the cat on the mat is really like saying, make it so I know whether the cat is on the mat.
Exactly.
Interesting.
So the big question then becomes, what do these we clauses actually mean within a larger sentence? What do they contribute to the meaning?
Right.
One idea is to treat them like that clauses as denoting propositions. That's the approach of Grönendijk and Stokov.
Okay.
Another option is to see them as denoting sets of propositions, as Karttunen argues.
Okay.
In the example, John knows who walks, under both views, the verb knows is expressing a relationship between John and the meaning of who walks.
Got it.
Now, Grönendijk and Stokov think that treating walk and that clauses in a similar way is a big advantage of their approach. It gives us a more unified account of sentence structure. And it's interesting that recent work in inquisitive semantics that the entry mentions is also trying to come up with a unified analysis. But Kartunen's view, what John reads, refers to a set of propositions like John reads Moby Dick, John reads War and Peace, and so on. All the true ones avoids a potential problem with Grönendijk and Stokoff's account.
Okay, what's the problem?
Well, their view might imply that knowing what John reads means you also know what he doesn't read, which doesn't always feel right.
Right.
But now we have Hintikka, who comes along and offers a different perspective. He says that weak clauses might not always be meaningful on their own. They might need to be interpreted in context, kind of like Russell's theory of definite descriptions.
Okay.
Phrases like the present king of France.
Right.
He argued that knowledge-wise sentences can be read in two ways, a universal reading and an existential reading.
Okay.
He used the example of, I know what is in the closet. Now, Kartunen disagreed with this specific ambiguity, but the distinction between mention some, knowing at least one answer, and mention all, knowing all the answers' readings, has been widely accepted.
Got it.
Then we have Braun, who throws a curveball with his information provision account. He suggests that answering a question is simply giving any true information about the topic.
So knowing who someone is just means knowing any true fact about them.
Exactly.
Even if it's not very useful or relevant.
Exactly. That's what makes his view so radical.
Oh, wow.
This really contrasts with contextualist views like those of Bohr and Lycan and Masto, who argue that knowing the answer to a why question depends heavily on the context of the conversation. What you need to know can change depending on the situation.
Okay, I see the difference.
Now, Schaefer adds another layer of complexity with question relativity. He argues that knowing why isn't just about knowing certain facts in a particular context, but about knowing those facts in relation to the specific question being asked.
Okay, so give me an example.
He uses the classic example of knowing that the cat is on the mat.
Right.
Now, if you know that, does that automatically mean you know where the cat is or what is on the mat?
I see what you mean.
Schaefer says that those might not be the same thing without taking into account the implicit question being asked. He even suggests that all knowledge might be question relative in a way.
That's a big claim.
It is. But then Aloni and Negre offer a different take. They think that these examples show that there's a pragmatic ambiguity in how we understand what it means to know the answer.
Okay.
Now, Brogard jumps into the mix, arguing that what clauses are actually predicates like properties or descriptions, and that knowledge is a form of knowledge.
Knowledge.
Yeah, it means knowing something about a specific thing or individual.
Okay.
But Masto points out a problem with this. He says that it doesn't work well for other verbs that take what clauses, like wonder. You can wonder who did something, but you don't really have wonder about someone in the same way you might have knowledge about them.
Right.
This highlights the difference between what are called responsive predicates, like know and remember, which can take both declarative and interrogative clauses, and rogative predicates like wonder and inquire, which usually only take interrogative clauses.
Okay.
The entry also explores this idea of false belief sensitivity. This suggests that even if you know the correct answer to a question, your knowledge can be messed up by false beliefs you might have.
So even if you have the right information, a false belief can affect your knowledge.
Exactly. They use this example about two newsstands, both selling Italian newspapers.
Okay.
Two people might both know which newsstand sells the specific newspaper you want, which is a true proposition.
Right.
But if one of them also mistakenly thinks that the other newsstand sells it, that false belief might affect whether we say they truly know where to buy the paper.
Interesting.
And there's actually empirical research that supports this idea.
Really?
Yeah.
So false beliefs can actually undermine our knowledge.
It seems so. And lastly, the section talks about how different verbs work with different types of clauses. It breaks down predicates into responsive ones, which can take both declarative and interrogative clauses, rogative ones, which only take interrogative clauses, and even anti-rogative ones, which only take declarative clauses like suspect or hope.
Wow, they really break it down.
They do. And Friedman argues that those attitudes expressed by rogative predicates actually have questions as their content, not just propositions.
Okay.
And research in formal semantics is ongoing, trying to figure out why these different verb types have these specific rules about what kind of clauses they can take.
It's fascinating how much depth there is to something as seemingly simple as a question.
Isn't it? We've explored so much. We've looked at those fundamental definitions and the different semantic theories for those basic elementary questions. From thinking about them as sets of possible answers to seeing them as partitions of logical space, as dynamic tools that shape our conversations, and as the foundation for both inquisitive semantics and structured meanings.
Right, and we've grappled with those why questions which bring their own unique challenges and looked at formal, pragmatic, and even metaphysical perspectives on what it means to truly explain something.
Yeah, and we dove into the world of embedded questions and knowledge encountering ideas about how context matters, how knowledge can be relative to the question being.